Welcome to the finance panel, Finanspanelen. This is a seminar series that has been going on for quite a number of years, and it is a co-production between SNS, the award-winning Swedish think tank, and the Swedish House of Finance, a national center for financial research located at the Stockholm School of Economics. My name is Pehr Wissén, and I will be moderating this event. We are very happy and proud to have Markus Brunnermeier with us from Princeton University today. Markus is a professor of economics and director of the Bendheim Center for Finance and one of the world's leading scholars in macroeconomics and the field of financial economics. It is early morning in New Jersey, and we really appreciate Markus taking his time to join us for this discussion. Earlier this year, he published a book called The Resilient Society. It is receiving a lot of attention worldwide. It is shortlisted as Business Book of the Year by the Financial Times, awarded the Financial Book of the Year at the Frankfurt Book Fair, and it's translated to different countries. It receives a lot of attention, and we are very happy to have this opportunity to hear Markus explain it to us. And to comment on his, we are equally happy and proud to have Karolina Ekholm, professor at the Stockholm University, and Paulina Dejmek from the EU Commission to comment. So we will do like this. Markus starts with a 30-minute summary presentation of topics in the book, followed by 2 times 7 minutes by Karolina and Paulina. And I strongly encourage you in the audience to post questions or comments in the Q&A field as we go along, because we will have something like 20 minutes for a general discussion between us on the contents of the book. So with these words, Markus Brunnermeier, you have our undivided attention for the next 30 minutes.
Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be here. So I would like to present my book, and I'll give you a quick outline of what it is all about. So essentially, the question we're facing more and more shocks. Of course, we're just living through the COVID crisis, so that's a pandemic, but we might have future pandemics again. We surely will have some antibiotic resistance problems down the road, some further financial crises, cyber attacks, and natural disasters. And, you know, there are new technologies coming up, and each technology will come up with certain hiccups. And typically we have a lot of crises, and typically a crisis doesn't come alone. It comes in pairs or triplets. And I would argue that, you know, resisting all the shocks is futile. Actually, what we really have to do is to be resilient. And I would like to discuss what resilience is and how is it different from being robust, and how is it different from being avoiding risk, and what type of redundancies do we need in order to have a resilient society. Now, the first thing I would like to draw a contrast to robustness. And robustness is different from resilience. Robustness means you really block off any shock and you can handle it. It's a little bit like an oak. It's a very strong oak. Whenever a wind comes, it doesn't move much. It really is very rigid. But I would argue rigidity is not stability. It's actually rigidity is the wrong thing to get a stable society. What you really want is if you have a resilient society where, you know, resilience means you're hit by a shock and then you can bounce back. So you don't block it off totally. You might take it in and then you bounce back. It's a little bit like a reed. And that goes back to an old writing by the French poet La Fontaine in the 17th century, who compared the oak and the reed. The oak is very rigid, but it has a robustness barrier. So once the wind is very, very strong, if a hurricane comes, it falls over and can't come back up. So there's a tipping point. Beyond the tipping point, it can't back up. While the reed is always bouncing back and forth and seems very, very volatile, very weak, it's actually bouncing back even after a hurricane. So it's in the poem, the reed tells the oak, I bend, I bow, but I do not break. So that's essentially what I have in mind here. And this also related to some earlier work I did on the volatility paradox, essentially meaning the reed seems very volatile, very weak, but at the end of the day, it's more stable than the oak, even though the oak seems very rigid and very, very not moving much. And this also has implications. What type of redundancies do we need? do we need redundancies for any type of shock? And this would be, I think, infeasible. So we need redundancies which are flexible and can be redeployed. It might take a little time to redeploy them, to adjust them in order to fit for the shock, but we need very, very few redundancies. But we need redundancies, but we need them in a flexible way. And I think that's the key to understand. But how much flexibility do we really need? There's this old debate in economics between rules and discretion. And I would say, you need rules, how to redeploy them as well, because if you have too much flexibility, then your communication is not credible, because that, oh, I'm very flexible, I act to that, but then people will think, oh, will he stick to it for a while in this new rule, this new outcome, or will he just revert very quickly? So if you have some rules, some credibility, it helps a lot to overcome a crisis as well. So that's essentially not meaning that you should throw all rules across the board. You need some flexibility, but associated with flexible rules, which are more state contingent than a very rigid rules. Now, the second thing I would like to do, resilience is also not the same as avoiding risk altogether, because risk is really a static concept. It's about the variance of, let's say, a random variable. Resilience is a dynamic concept. It is about the bouncing back. It's about the mean reversion, so over time. So in this sense, resilience is different. And if you're resilient, you can actually take on some risk. And that actually might lead you to a higher growth path. And what I've depicted here, so you have this dashed line here, that's a riskless path. And I have a resilient path, but it actually has an expectation that it's a higher growth. But whenever you fall in a recession, you bounce back. So in this sense, the resilient path in the long run will lead you much better off. And actually in the long run, even in a recession, you are still better off than in the riskless part. So that's, I think, important to keep in mind. Now, if you look at what risk should you take and what risk should you avoid, then actually it's very important that you look for risks which have resilience attached to it. So you want to avoid risk without resilience, so-called resilience destroyers or resilience killers. So that's essentially what I identify: 3 resilience destroyers. One are traps, feedbacks, and tipping points. So what are traps? So if you have a shock and you're trapped, then it's actually the case that there's no point of return from this trap. So there's a trap, you're hit by a shock, and then there's resilience killers going on there. Feedbacks are even worse. So it's not only that you're hit by a shock, but then you're hit and you're at a feedback point, and then you have an adverse feedback loop, and then it makes things worse and worse and worse. And finally, then there are tipping points. And the tipping points, you have situations where there's this process goes like this, and then you hit the tipping point, and then you really get in this feedback point. So you should watch out for tipping points. So let's not avoid any type of risk. Let's avoid risk with resilience destroyers, and that come with traps, feedbacks, and tipping points. And in climate change, you have this very prominently, these tipping points. If the permafrost area you cannot undo it. Once it's melting, you cannot undo it. Or if the Gulf Stream stops, you cannot switch on the Gulf Stream again, and all of Europe will be much colder climate. And this is actually, these are tipping points. These are risks one should avoid. Now, the next thing I would like to say is that tipping points and resilience, they can go in either way. So here I have 2 tipping points where I have a path which is riskless. So I just tilted this a little bit. The dashed one is riskless, but then you hit a tipping point and then it gets out of control. It's actually better to take the risky path with resilience, and this way you can avoid the tipping point. So it's not clear that actually, going for more risky things actually is worse in terms of overall risk, as long as it avoids a tipping point. So in this case, in this particular case, avoiding any risk will lead to a downward path, then hits the tipping point. Going for some more risky but resilient path will actually allow you to avoid the tipping point. So that's a very important aspect to take into account. Now, of course, if the tipping point is much more dramatic, when it's much closer, we're already closer to the tipping point, then it might also be going for the resilient part, might also be a danger of hitting here. But of course, you have to take the chances here, essentially, because if this does not occur, that's a downward move, then actually you might be better off, because the dashed line will for surely hit the tipping point. So this is a stochastic way, and you might avoid a tipping point here. So tipping points are very, very important to watch out for, in particular in connection to climate change, as I mentioned before. Now, this also leads me to another environmental aspect. What is sustainability, and how does sustainability lead to resilience? Now, sustainability is essentially means that you're resilient, plus you need no adverse trend. So resilience alone is not enough in order to have a sustainable development. So you need here, what I've depicted here, you have a resilient path, but it goes downhill, and hence it's not sustainable. So resilience alone is not enough. So what you need, resilience plus no adverse trend. So you need both of it, resilience, and that there's no negative trend associated with that. That leads to sustainability. So sustainability is harder to achieve than resilience alone. Now, resilience comes at different levels. It comes at the individual level. There's a huge psychological literature on this, how to be more resilient. It comes at the system level. Think about an electric grid, some networks, global value chains, and so forth. That's, more or less resilient as well. But the book is really about how to make the society resilient. What makes societies very interesting is that it's about the interaction of people and what people think, how others will react to their own behavior, and what they believe, what the other people think, and so forth. So it's about externalities and responses to externalities. And these endogenous reactions to others, that actually makes the society either resilient or less resilient. And what you really have to watch out, besides this feedback, are these feedback externalities. And I've depicted here a simple example in an abstract way. There's a person A. The person A does something, it acts in a particular way. This causes a negative externality on person B, and person B suffers because of the action of person A. But that's an externality. We typically handle externalities in economics. But now it comes the reaction of person B. The person B reacts, which causes a network externality back to person A, and this actually a spillback, let's say, causes then person A to react even more strongly, which causes more externality to person B, and so forth. And you can have a whole spiral in this. And actually what's really important is to look out for externalities. But externalities, we have all over the place, but feedback externalities are way more dangerous than pure externalities on their own, because feedback externalities multiply the externalities back and forth and make it much more quantitatively, much more significant. And that's essentially in economic lingo. If you have externalities bundled with strategic complementarities, that's actually where the danger lies. And we have to identify them. I think that's the key of this insight, to identify them when we have these externalities, and then we have to try to limit them. When we have to limit them in the social contract. And what's a social contract? I take a very economic perspective, where it's about having externalities and limiting externalities. So the social contract tries to limit externalities caused by others. So that's, when I fall sick, I also will, I'm contagious, I also make others sick. That's an externality. Somehow I have to limit it. The social contract has to be such that I be careful in order to protect the others. But externalities can also come from Mother Nature. So we also suffer as a society, or individuals, we suffer shocks. That's essentially almost like Mother Nature is doing something which causes a negative externality on us. And the social contract helps us to do this and come together. And what's interesting is that there's a tension here between diversity and homogeneity. So when we have different shocks, you face a shock, I don't face a shock at this time, the other time it's the other way around, we can insure each other. So an insurance is a way to handle it. What resilience means, we not only want to insure each other and throw money at each other to compensate the losses, but we also would like to help others to come out again and with their own effort to bounce back. So helping people to bounce back. But if a society is more diverse, then we have different shocks, so we can help each other better. So diversity helps in terms of having better shock absorbers, better insurance, a better social system there. But we also know from the late Alberto Alesina, the more homogeneous the societies, the more willing they are to insure each other. So while diversity helps a lot to be better in a position to insure each other, homogeneity helps to be more willing to insure each other. And that there's a tension there. So the Scandinavian countries, as Europe, they're more homogeneous, and because of homogeneity, you have a better social security protection. So there is more willingness to help each other, but you also are more similar. So most shocks are more aggregate shocks or systematic shocks rather than idiosyncratic shocks. And finally, how to implement it, the social contract, and what's often underestimated in economics, how the importance of social norms. So social norms play a huge role in order to self-police each other, in order to make sure that people do something. People who have an identity, they want to be part of a group, and that group is governed by social norms. And that has a huge implications to what extent the social contract is limiting externalities. Of course, then you have also markets, and we have governments, so we can have either, ownership structures and tradable permits and things like that. That's a market solution, or you have a government intervening, outlawing certain the actions which lead to certain externalities. And of course, that has between these three ways of implementing and the limits to externalities, that has to move around to be flexible as well in times of crisis. Now, what the book does, and what I just gave you a little glimpse, is essentially looking at the society and resilience in more abstract terms, and then it applies it to the corona crisis, or the COVID crisis, argues, how we have to contain the crisis, what are different externality measures in the health context, and in parallel, you have to develop also a bounce back strategy to a new normal. In the case of the COVID crisis, it was essentially developing the vaccines, and you have to do both in parallel. So it's just going for a zero COVID, no COVID strategy or something, and not having a strategy how to bounce back is futile as well. So you have to have combination of both of these. And then the main part of the book is looking at different macro resilience phenomena, innovation boost and scarring. It argues how much the financial sector was at danger to collapse. In March 2020, it was about to collapse, and then it bounced back. I call it the financial whipsaw. It argues about public debt. I go more into that. And an inflation whipsaw. So first we had these deflationary pressures in the early phase of the COVID crisis, and then you have this bounce back of high inflation. So that's the inflation whipsaw. And then the final part of the book goes very much at the global resilience components. So let me go a little bit more in the detail. I mentioned already a lot the climate change aspects, and let me perhaps just pick certain aspects to that. So what's in the climate change, what's really important there is that you want to have a clear path forward. You want to remove uncertainty. Whenever you have uncertainty, it is actually the case that you have to pay a risk premium. So whoever wants to invest in new climate technologies, he has to pay, has to get some funding for that. And he has to get some risk. He has to, if it's very risky, if there's uncertainty, he has to pay a risk premium for that. So the funding costs, instead of being 2-3%, it might be 8% of cost of capital. And that makes a huge difference how big the funding costs are. So what's important is you would like to have a policy framework which pre-specifies, for example, the cost of carbon, the carbon price. So it's a clear price path. Or you can have a less uncertainty in the emissions. So if you don't want the emissions to be volatile, you pre-specified the number of permits, of tradable permits you give to the industry or to the public more generally. So both, you can either pre-specify the price, or can remove uncertainty from the price, or you can remove the uncertainty from the quantity. These are two different ways one can go. Or you can also take an interim solution where you have some tradable permits and adjust the supply of them in order you go for tradable permits, but you adjust the supply of that such that the price is not jumping too much. But in general, what you want to do, you want to make an announcement for the next 10 years or 15, 20 years, we will change the carbon price or the carbon emissions in a less stochastic way, in a more deterministic way. And this reduces the cost of new investment, gives some planning certainty for investors, what to do, when to do, and how to push it. And that's what you'd want to do today. But then later on, when we learn more, we have to be flexible and say, let's suppose we figure out actually the climate situation is much more dramatic than anticipated, then we have to tighten it further. So we would like to keep some flexibility. On the one hand, we would like to, right now, to promise everybody that there will be no changes in the policy in order to reduce risk premium. On the other hand, we want to keep some flexibility later on to adapt, react, and re-optimize to be resilient. And you can see, in particular, if we figure out there's a tipping point around the corner, so we have to tighten things, or we can also loosen things depending what we learn over time. And you can see there's a tension. Ex ante would like to fix things, ex post we would like to change things, and there's a time consistency problem. And that's in the climate change, the same time consistency problem like in monetary policy and in other areas of policy. And this tension one has to manage to keep in mind when we manage things, that the flexibility is actually calling, this resilience calls for some flexibility exposed, but it might have its cost by having a higher risk premium ex ante. And to manage this tension, I think is very important in the context of climate change, because we are talking here about a long run phenomenon going on. So on top of it, of course, in the climate change, as I mentioned earlier, the sustainability definition, the resilience is really crucial, and also avoiding tipping points like the Gulf Stream. Now let me move to another aspect I would just touch upon in this few minutes, is about government debt, fiscal policy, and resilience in connection to COVID. So if you look at the government debt here, I take the US example, where you look at debt to GDP ratio, that's a shaded area here. That's, debt to GDP moved to 100% in the United States after the Second World War, because the war efforts required a lot of government expenditures. And then it moved up even before the COVID crisis. The Great Recession led to a huge increase of government debt. And if you look at the projections going forward, so that's a Congressional Budget Office projections, you see it is projected to go by 2050 to 200%. So right now we are above 100% and is supposed to go to 200%. So that sounds really scary. On the other hand, what really is different is that if you look at this line here, or this curve, that's the cost of the debt, what the debt servicing cost, how much interest you have to pay. So the debt level is going up a lot, but the interest you have to pay for that is not going up so much. And that's essentially what's shown here on this line, and so it's going up subsequently, but it's still 2% of GDP, something like that. And now the question is, should we actually not focus so much on debt to GDP, or should we focus much more on the debt servicing cost when evaluating public debt levels? And I would argue, we should actually focus on this debt servicing cost, but we should focus on the stochastic element of that, because the interest rate might suddenly jump. And to understand this, when the interest rate might jump and why, I think it's very important to look at so-called value at risk. Value at risk is a measure, how risky is it that the debt servicing cost suddenly might jump? And then one has to look at these phenomena very clearly. So let me just explain a little bit in economic terms, why is it the case that the interest rate is so low on government debt? Why is government debt somehow special? And why is it often referred to as being a safe asset? So a safe asset is an asset which, allows people to save in, and if they have a shock, a personal shock, suddenly they have to, the car breaks down or the washing machine breaks down, they can actually dip into this safe asset, sell it at a fair price, at a fairly high price to somebody else, and then buy a new washing machine or whatever they can. So that's a safe asset. So in times of need, it is there. It's like, I often call it a safe asset, like a good friend. A good friend in need is a friend indeed. And that's the same thing for a safe asset. And so the safe asset gives you more. It doesn't only give you interest payments and all that. It also gives this service flow that if you are in need, you can actually sell it off and swap it for something else. And this, in a general setting, some of us will have a negative personal shock, others will not. And we can insure each other, even though markets are not perfectly functional. We cannot buy all of these insurances. We can self-insure by saving in the safe asset. And it gives you the service flow. So you're happy to hold this safe asset, even though the interest payment or the dividend payments are very low, because you get this service flow. And that's why the governments have to pay relatively little on the interest. And the more uncertainty there is, and the more risk there is for the society, the higher is the service flow, and the less the government has to pay in terms of cash flow, in terms of interests. And that's, in societies where the social security is not very developed, there will be a lot more need to insure yourself against various idiosyncratic risks, and the service flow will be higher. And that allows the government to have this low interest rate bearing bonds to issue, and it's a big benefit the government has. But the problem is, then the question is, how long will the service flow stay? It only stays when everybody believes that as long as, there's a safe asset, and when there's a crisis, everybody will rush into the safe asset. And actually, it will be the case that we all believe the safe asset will appreciate in value. And it belongs to this, and it really hinges on this belief that when there's a crisis, everybody is rushing into the safe asset. And this safe asset status might be lost. And that's why there's this, you have to look out for this value at risk, because you suddenly, when the safe asset status is lost, the interest rate has to shoot up because you don't get the service flow anymore. Suddenly the investors will demand some high interest rate, some cash flow instead. Let me jump over that because of some time constraints. So let me illustrate a little bit what the book does by showing up. I emphasized already that we should actually refocus the way we think about government debt, but not only by the debt to GDP ratio, but also about the debt burden and the volatility of the debt burden. And this hinges very much on the safe asset aspects to it. Now, as I said, the book is actually covering many, many areas. And let me just outline a few in a very broad brush sense. So one is the health component. And I mentioned the vaccines are really the way to go back to new normal. And there is an innovation boost. The mRNA vaccines will help us in many, many dimensions to solve problems, malaria problems. There will be new vaccines on this. There will be new vaccines for cancer treatment even. And so there's a huge innovation going on in this area. So that is a resilience bouncing back to some new normal, which might be better than the old normal. Now, in terms of macroeconomics, I've just argued that the interest rate is becoming lower and lower, and there's a low interest rate environment. That means there's more space in the fiscal side, and there's less space in the monetary side. So when the interest rate is low, actually governments have to pay less on the debt. So there's more room for that. But it also means that for monetary policy, there's less room to push interest rates down because you have hit essentially the zero, the effective lower bound. So the space where you can actually create resilience through policy measures is actually moving from the monetary side to the fiscal side. Now, if you look at the financial policy aspects, where can you build resilience there? And what you want is essentially you want some efficient debt restructuring. So bouncing back is hard if there's a debt overhang problem. So we build up all this debt, and then you can't come back if there's a so-called debt overhang problem. So for this, you need a bankruptcy code which is very efficient on the individual level and also on the corporate level in order to avoid not being bouncing back. And more generally, having more things equity financed is actually a more resistant, a more resilient arrangement than debt finance. So here I come back to my read and the oak from the beginning. You see that a debt contract, so depending on the x-axis, whatever the underlying cash flow is, for sovereign, it might be tax revenue, for company, it might be some cash flow revenue. The debt promise is always something fixed. So it's fairly stable. It's not very volatile. It's only once the cash flows come in very poorly that the debt contract will actually jump down and there will be default. And suddenly there's this default costs, bankruptcy costs, and other things. And the oak falls over and can't come back up. The company goes bankrupt and it's hard to get back up. Well, the equity contract is like this 45-degree line. So it always moves as the underlying moves, as the underlying cash flow is moving, the equity value is moving as well. So it constantly moves like the REIT. It seems much less stable, but as a society as a whole, an equity-focused society or financial system is much more stable because it's less run-prone and it is a much more, stable because it can bounce back much more easily compared to a very debt-focused society or economic system. Now you can have many more different aspects in the financial context in terms of international economics. If you have flexible exchange rates combined with macroprudential regulations, you have actually, by letting the exchange rate go, you can bounce back more easily. You have, for example, with distributed ledger technologies, some blockchain technologies, you can have some more resilience in the system because there are a lot of redundancies in the system. Of course, it comes at some cost. It's quite inefficient to have some certain proof of work type of blockchains. There's this concept of resilience inequality. which is a new concept where saying actually people can be different not only in income and in wealth, but also how easily they can bounce back. Two people might be equally wealthy and have the same income, but the first person, when it's hit by a shock, can bounce back and the second person cannot. Then there's the whole global aspects, the global value chains, which are very much more focused just in time, but in the future they should become much more focused in just in case. Then you want to perhaps introduce stress tests on global value chains, the same way we introduce stress tests for banks after the global financial crisis. Then for the emerging economies, they have suffering from a poverty trap. Remember, traps were one of these resilience killers, poverty traps, middle income traps. That's something to watch out for. And I mentioned already all the global geopolitics, the role of the global role of the dollar. How can we stabilize capital flows, international capital flows? And I mentioned before already different aspects of climate change. So let me conclude again with climate change, the tipping points, again, after traps, another form of resilience killers. But being resilient is not enough for sustainability, as I mentioned before. You need resilience plus no adverse trends. So the absence of adverse trends plus resilience, that's what's needed in order to get a sustainable society and a sustainable system to live in. So let me conclude with that. And I thank you again for giving me this opportunity to be with you this afternoon in Sweden. And I'm looking forward to enriching discussion. And thanks again.
Thank you very much, Markus. There is a lot to discuss in this agenda, and we will come back to that. But first, we would like to listen to Karolina Ekholm. Karolina has been at this seminar series before. She is now a professor of economics at the Stockholm University. She has been deputy governor of the central bank. She has been secretary of state at the Ministry of Finance, and she has accepted an appointment as director general of the National Debt Office in beginning of next year, I think. Karolina, you are very much welcome, and now you have our undivided attention for the next 7 minutes or so. Please.
Thank you, Pehr, and thank you, Markus, for your presentation. And let me begin by saying that the book that Markus has written is a great book. It covers many areas, as he said. It should be read by everyone. I really encourage you. It covers many different aspects of how societies cope with negative shocks and also more structural challenges. As you could tell from the presentation, it covers broad issues such as what kind of social contracts there are to discussions on the role of particular policies. Now my role was to try to relate the material to the Swedish situation in one way or another, and I noted there is a little bit of bad mouthing of Sweden in the book. Sweden is cited along with Brazil as an example of how not to deal with the COVID pandemic. And well, my personal view is that that's somewhat unfair, although there are, of course, many aspects of the way the pandemic has been dealt with that in Sweden that can be criticized. But in a sense, my impression is that the Swedish approach fits in relatively well with the type of resilient society that Markus seems to be advocating. I mean, to a large extent, people have been allowed to decide for themselves how to trade off the risks that they take themselves and expose others to regarding catching COVID-19 against the inconveniences they face by being confined to home and being very restricted in their movements. So I think Sweden is an example of this type of open society where the government is relying primarily on the power of persuasion. And that's different from societies that have implemented more restrictive strategies with explicit lockdowns and curfews. And they would be associated more with the concept of risk avoidance that Markus writes about in the book. And also alluded to in the presentation, that just simply trying to avoid risk altogether. So I'm going to focus a bit on the response to the COVID pandemic. And so my view on how it has affected, the pandemic has affected the Swedish economy is that it never really had such a great effect that the economy went into a full-blown crisis. There was a dramatic decline in economic activity in the spring of 2020, along with turbulence in financial markets. So we had this, I think Markus referred to sort of a financial whipsaw. And as in other places, the stress in financial markets that seemed to subside fairly quickly. And when it comes to economic activity, I would say that in the manufacturing sector, it had by and large recovered by the fall of 2020. So what has remained is a longer lasting, relatively severe reduction of activity in parts of the service sector. And it's the part that relies on activities that require close contact with customers, such as hotels and restaurants and gyms and beauty parlors and whatnots. Wellness centers, I guess, is the more modern term. But the fact that the COVID-19 shock never really led to a full-blown economic crisis, of course, that may be primarily due to the massive and swift interventions that were made by both the government and the central bank, the Riksbank. There were generous support schemes directed to firms on the fiscal side, large-scale asset purchases on the monetary side. Now, I interpret this as being Markus's view that these massive interventions were crucial in generating this bounce back. But of course, it may also be that the economy actually was so resilient already at the outset that it would have bounced back fairly quickly, even without this, without all these measures. I mean, I'm not suggesting that all of the measures could have been redundant. Obviously, some were quite crucial. But I think there is an argument to be made that some of these measures have been a bit excessive, and that's something that I would be interested in hearing Markus's view on. So he does write in the book that while the central bank's asset purchases or purchases of assets whose spreads were rising in the spring, that provided effective backstops. It's something that also is associated with a cost. So risk-taking is encouraged by these type of actions that were undertaken, and that could then lead to concerns about future moral hazard. And I think in Sweden, there are some clear indications that this has been the case. Spreads on corporate bonds and covered bonds, which are part of the Riksbank's asset purchase program, they have become lower than they were before the pandemic. So that to me indicates a mispricing of risk, and something that very well could lead the economy to become less resilient in the future. And I wonder which private company would ever consider paying for private pandemic insurance, or perhaps any private insurance that would protect them from tail events after having observed the massive support paid out to firms during this event. So I would pose the question, at least, I mean, is there a risk that the way this negative shock has been dealt with leads to more risk-taking and less self-insurance, and thereby makes our societies less resilient in the future? I think that's related to what is said in the book about there being potentially dynamic trade-offs and some sort of term structure of resilience. So I would be interested in hearing Markus's thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karolina. We will come back to that. I noticed the questions, and I guess maybe Markus did as well. Our second commenter is Paulina Dejmek, who is Director of General Affairs at DG FISMA at the European Commission. Paulina has held several senior positions in the Commission and was the financial advisor of the then Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker between 2014 and 2019. And you also worked with Michel Barnier during the negotiations on the Trading Cooperation Agreement with the United Kingdom 2019 and 20. And you also have a doctorate degree in law from Heidelberg, Germany. And you have also visited us in this seminar series before a couple of years ago. And we are very happy to have you back. And we are very much looking forward to your 7-ish minutes comment on Markus's book. Paulina, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pehr, and good afternoon to everyone. Good morning to Markus. First of all, to say thank you for inviting me. This is really a very fascinating opportunity. As Karolina already said, Markus' book is fascinating reading and surely something that everyone should have a look at. The book is also very rich and very comprehensive, as I think came through Markus' presentation, although I think there are many more things in the book and many more very interesting chapters. I want to be relatively brief. I have 7 minutes and I've already used 30 seconds or so. I wanted to look at some of the issues Markus mentioned in his presentation from a bit of an EU perspective. I think Karolina covered well, of course, the Swedish side of things. There are 4 points I wanted to make to be more precise, starting with the resilience, the concept of resilience, which is very much, I think, let's say, the guiding light through Markus' book. An important part of this is the adaptability. I think Markus mentioned that very, very clearly. And I think that's, of course, also a little bit the premise of the book, that the COVID crisis, the pandemic, has clearly been a test of this resilience. I think in that context that there is also the element of society really, let's say, developing with the pandemic. If I look at the European experience, which of course was, I think, by and large, a little bit different from the Swedish one in terms of continental Europe in general having a lot of restrictions. I live in Brussels, Belgium, where infection rates are going up a lot as we speak. And I think that people, of course, the citizens have to some extent learned to live with these restrictions. And even more so if we think about the various societal responses, if we, again, the European perspective, in the beginning of the pandemic, a lack of personal protection equipment, then a lack of vaccines, countries are very much turning inwards. And then later on, I think, very successful common vaccine procurement, COVID travel certificate that had made it easier for citizens to cross borders, vaccination campaigns, of course, ongoing in all the EU member states. So I think it's been interesting to see also how this kind of resilience have actually adapted, adjusted over time. And of course, with, let's say, every wave that we unfortunately had to face in this pandemic situation. Interesting in that context also, I think the whole debate around critical infrastructures, the issue of supply chains, it's, I think, very well covered in the book. I think we didn't have time to look at that yet, but that's, of course, something else that we've seen, that I think a lot of jurisdictions around the world have started looking at the just-in-time delivery concepts that has been very much guiding our economy. And of course, in a situation like the pandemic, we see that maybe there is merit in onshoring a little bit more of production and have it a bit closer. And that's certainly something that we have been looking at in the European Union. That brings me to my second point, and that's something that Karolina already touched on, and that is, why was the pandemic so different from the global financial crisis that started back in 2008, 2009? I think Karolina mentioned rightly that there was, of course, some financial market turbulence in March 2020, but relatively quickly things stabilized in a rather good way. Now, I think, as the book rightly says, a lot of this is, of course, down to a lot of interventions from the governments and very much from the central banks around the world, the central banks that could afford to do so. I do think, however, also that there is an important element here, which is that I think our financial sector was in a much better state going into this crisis compared to where we were in 2008 and 2009. I think back in the global financial crisis, the financial sector was basically the problem and where the crisis started. In this situation, in the pandemic, the financial sector has actually been part of the solution. The banks have continued to lend to the real economy. We have seen that corporate insolvencies have not gone up in the way we would have expected. Non-performing loans still remain at low levels. Now, obviously, that's also due to the fact that a lot of the very accommodating policies are still in place. But nevertheless, I think that is a rather interesting difference. And a lot of this goes down to the debate that we had at the international level back in 2008, 2009, 2010, leading to a reinforcement of the regulatory framework of banks, of frame many more rules around trading, transparency, and many other things. And I think that is something that, at least in Europe, we have seen very clearly that these regulatory reforms that were taken in the wake of the financial crisis were really helpful and kind of paid off now in the pandemic. Third point I wanted to mention is the social contract, which Markus mentioned, and which is obviously, I think, a very interesting dimension of the resilience debate. Here, I think it gets quite interesting if you look at it from a European level perspective, because a lot of policy is European. We have, of course, the monetary policy from the European Central Bank. We have a trade and competition policy that remains, that is entirely exclusive EU competence, a lot of internal market rules that cover everything from financial services to all kinds of products and everything you can think of. And at the same time, if we look at the social area, here we are in something which is still very much a national competence when it comes to social benefits, when it comes to pensions, when it comes to generally the kind of the services that citizens can rely on in their daily life. This is very much something that is dealt with nationally, with much less EU rules and much less of an EU framework. And it struck me a little bit that is, of course, quite interesting, because then you have a overall economic context that is largely in Europe in a way dealt with at a common and collective level, whereas many of the things that relate to the social contract and how much people trust their government, trust their fellow citizens, is actually something that is purely national in Europe. And that's, of course, the way it should be. That's the way the competences are divided. But I think that is a kind of interesting, let's say, European dimension to the social contract discussion, which is probably slightly different from if you look at it in the US, for example. And then I'm coming to my final point, my fourth point, and something which Markus, I think, rightly spent some time on also in his presentation, and that is the whole climate change debate and what we have learned from the pandemic, and unfortunately are still learning because we are still in a pandemic, can also be very applicable to the climate change debate. And there, as Markus said, the price of carbon is, of course, absolutely fundamental. In the European Union, we are trying to do quite a lot on that issue. We will be extending our emission trading systems to all sectors of transport, to building policy. We are looking at what we call a carbon border adjustment mechanism. I think all that goes very much in direction of what Markus was mentioning. We are also looking at what we call the taxonomy, which is having a classification system so that investors know how to channel their investments into green projects. And disclosure is another important part here, making sure that it's clear for investors, for citizens, where companies are investing. So I think a lot of measures which in a way, Markus touched on in one way or the other, where I think it's also interesting to see how this can actually translate into relatively concrete policy actions. Of course, not only Europe doing this, there are a lot of discussions in this around the world, as we saw also in the COP26 very, very recently. I think my 7 minutes are up, so I will stop there, and looking forward to continuing the discussion in the minutes to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those were great questions, and Markus, they were posed to you. Before you start, I still don't have anything in the Q&A box here, so audience, you are encouraged to jump into the discussion. But Markus first, I don't know where we should start. Both Karolina and Paulina touched upon the differences between how this crisis was managed compared to the great financial crisis. And Karolina said something about were the responses maybe excessive this time? Could it have created moral hazard? Have we sort of gone too far? What are your comments on this?
Well, thanks a lot to both of you, Karolina and Paulina. These are fantastic comments and reactions. I try to touch upon them and try to address them. So the first to Karolina, yes, Sweden went a different way. It probably has different social norms, and there's probably more self-policing going on, and a different, way of internalizing externalities. Of course, it was focusing very much on going, the strategy of herd immunity early on. But I think what I found most interesting in discussing in the book essentially is that despite having not officially imposed a lockdown, the economic activity in the first wave of March 2020, April 2020, and so forth was actually very similar from economic perspective. So you see this across the Scandinavian countries. You see it more generally that even though you didn't impose a direct lockdown, it came indirectly through the global economy as well. And you also see this in the US when you compare different states within the US. Some states were very restrictive, the others were not, but both of them, the economic activity shrank simultaneously the same way. And then their second point was, as Pehr mentioned, are some of these measures excessive, and then also alluding to the term structure of resilience. So you can indeed say, okay, I'm doing too much now, and then actually I ruin my resiliency or my resilience possibilities in the future. That's where the term structure comes in. And indeed, it's the case that if you look at corporate bond spreads, research, and if you look at corporate bond issuance, they're just dramatic, exploded in 2020 and 2021. So as if there was, the biggest boom phase. If nobody knows that there's something, they would say there's the biggest boom phase. And I would say there is actually a danger of doing too much and then actually hiding problems down the road and not. So the question is, when should we get out of this, and can we get out of it in a smooth way, given that we move into dramatically? Overall, I would say, and that touches on what Karolina said as well, I think I'm less worried that that the government has to step in occasionally. I think markets are very good in self-stabilizing for small and intermediate-sized shocks. But if it's a really large shock, private markets cannot handle, and then the governments have to step in. The government has just this taxing power, has additional possibilities private markets will never have. So I think when there are huge shocks, we should actually allow the governments to come in, but also what's very important, the government should withdraw again. It should not use this as a power grab and then stay in, but it should also withdraw. But we should be aware that markets are not always self-stabilizing, particularly when we face very large shocks. Will this lead to more risk-taking and too little self-insurance? Overall, I think it matters. Actually, we should encourage more risk-taking in particular direction. So if it's risk-taking in R&D and something which causes positive externalities, I think there's too little risk-taking in these spaces. But if it's about speculating and driving house prices up, there's too much risk-taking. So it depends very much what type of risk people take. And I wouldn't say there's too much risk-taking. I think there's probably too little risk-taking in the innovative side, and too much risk-taking more on the speculative, just driving land prices up. And one has to differentiate between the two. But overall, fantastic points. Same as with Paulina, she made 4 points. And the first point was essentially that resilience adapted after each wave, and that's actually a good thing that, you know, we learned over time. So we didn't know much about the virus initially, and then we learned. And one big thing was essentially the countries turned inwards, and that's actually a very sad in a sense, because it was really when there's a shock from outside, a threat from outside, typically people unite. And this was the first, or one of the first, global threats for the whole human mankind. And it was not the case that countries united and said, okay, this is a global threat, we have to have a global response. But countries looked inwards, and even within the European Union, they looked inwards until some leaders decided, no, we have to deal this as a European aspect. And then it turned around. At least it was within Europe, it was dealt as a European threat. But we have to think about this more carefully, how to change the global architecture, institutional architecture, to make sure that the next threat is dealt at a more global scale rather than from country interest to country interest. About the global value chains, we need some critical architecture. There will be, should be less focus on just in time, more focus on just in case, as Paulina mentioned. But I think the answer is not only reshoring and bring everything back to the advanced economies. The answer is probably also multi-sourcing, where you outsource certain production not only to one country but to several countries across different continents in order to create more stability and more resilience by having it outsourced to different continents. So if one continent suffers a problem, you can still shift production to the other continent, and this way you can also achieve. So otherwise, we have huge implications for the emerging economies, and the emerging economies will suffer dramatically and will cause more poverty in these countries. Second point, yes, 2020 and 2021 was very different from 2008, from the global financial crisis. It required a different response. The global financial crisis was all about stimulating demand. Of course, we did a lot of demand stimulus too, but it was not really stimulating demand because people couldn't spend it anyway. It was much more solving, other issues, health issues and others. And the shock was also different. So while in 2008, there were some imbalances building up beforehand, and then it takes a while to correct the imbalances. The housing stock in the United States was too large. There was speculation, and this takes some time to work out afterwards. So that's why there was no bounce back very quickly. While the COVID shock was an exogenous shock coming from outside, and it was nobody's fault. And the policy response was way faster. And one main reason for that, or there are two main reasons. One is that we had the tools from the 2008 crisis. So whenever you went through a crisis, you learn how to deal with that. So we could just use it again. And the second reason is there was much less moral hazard attached to it. In the Euro crisis, for example, was all this moral hazard debate towards Greece and other countries. And we didn't have this debate at all because it was just nobody's fault. And that made it much easier for policymakers to act way more quickly and deal with that. And finally, the financial sector was in better shape as well because of previous financial regulation. But the third point about the social contract, I agree, there has to be trust in the society, but also trust in science and government. So I think that's what we still have to work on. I don't know how this will play out. There's probably was way more trust in the early phase. There was trust in science. There's some questions about this. But within Europe, we have essentially society, social contract at the European Union-wide level, but we also have a social contract within the nation and a social contract within your own hometown. And there are different levels of social contracts, and they're helping each other out. So, and we have to have interplay as we have the subsidiarity principle in Europe, and this actually is a healthy principle to say which society, which level should be, provide some social insurance or some helping each other out. And finally, for the climate change, my view is that the key, what we have learned from the COVID crisis, is that cutting back on production is not the answer. During the COVID crisis, we really had a global lockdown, but CO2 emissions hardly moved down. Of course, they moved down by 6, 7, 8%, but that's nothing compared to how much is going up. So the only answer is technology. So we have to fix and find the technological way out of that. So for this, we need investment in technology. And just, if a country like Sweden becomes climate neutral it doesn't do anything. If Germany becomes climate neutral, that's tiny. So these countries have an obligation to develop technologies which then other countries can adopt as well. So they have to become role models, technological leaders, in order for other countries to adopt these ways of creating energy. And I think that's the only way out. And that's what we have learned from the COVID crisis. And the way to do it is to just make investment in this technology much more easily. And I think you have to dip on the private markets. So the ingenuity is coming from the private sector to guide in this direction. I think it's very important. The carbon border adjustment mechanism, I think, is an element, but it has a little bit of a danger that it might be seen as colonialism, in the sense that it shuts down the emerging economies from exporting, and there will be quite some tension in the international arena and across the country. So the way of promoting new technologies and helping then others to adopt the technologies as well, I think will probably do a much quicker, a much more powerful way of dealing with that. Of course, one warning signal, if I may say so, the German government in the 2000s has really promoted solar power. So that was, Schröder government at that time, and it really boosted the solar technology until, suddenly many new companies came up and all this. There was a huge boom, and Germany put billions, and we're still paying at high energy prices for that. And suddenly the whole industry moved to China a few years later, and in Germany the industry collapsed more or less. So the question is, what have we learned from that period? Was this a mistake or not? You could say, oh, that helped nevertheless the climate. It just was very expensive for the Germans. But is there something similar we can do and avoid essentially that it just totally moves to another country or another continent? But can we do something similar along these lines? So overall, thanks a lot for all these questions and perspectives. And I think we covered a lot of ground, thanks to you, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. We do have some questions from the audience. Bertram Steininger, I think you've answered that one. And Alexandra Leonard, on sort of, do you think the EU is taking up too much debt to increase investment? And you touched upon sort of the principles against which we should take a stand on how much debt is too much debt. But sort of looking at the current situation, there is a lot of discussion. Is the US having too much debt? Is the EU having too much debt? So what would be your take on that?
Yeah, so I think it depends very much what you use the debt for. If it's, some growth enhancing initiatives, then it's actually less problematic. Overall, if you ask me, if I just look at the CBO projections for the US, I don't think this debt level is sustainable. I mean, this is not, in the long run, there has to be some way to resolve that. The current path the US is on is not sustainable. Similarly, many European countries, we have to really think about, and there's a rethinking, how to evaluate that. And I think we have to find some new Maastricht criteria, new rules which seem credible. So if, in a sense, if you say we want 60% debt to GDP, nobody will take this rule seriously because it's too far out. So we need some rules which seem more credible and take also into account what the interest rate burden is. And that's why I proposed this, looking at the interest rate burden as well. But not only at the current interest rate burden. I think it would be misleading also on the likelihood that the interest rate might jump. So that, of course, it depends on the debt level itself again. Overall, I think we have to go into a phase of consolidation. So we have this huge expansion phase, and it's easily spent. And the big danger I see, there was at least some months ago, there was an attitude, oh, we can go into debt. There's no cost to debt. And then you don't spend it wisely anymore. I think you really have to the advantage of having a high interest burden is that you're much more focused to spend it wisely. And if it's too cheap, essentially, you just spend it without thinking so much. And I think that's what we have to think on. But I also have to say, if you think about what Europe did with the Next Generation program and all that, that was necessary to keep Europe together. I had many Italian friends who told me in the early phase of the crisis, why do we have the European Union if they don't help us now? And they were very disappointed. And in April 2020, when Merkel and Macron had this agreed to this initiative, that turned around. And this was really essential for keeping the European Union together. But I think we also have to be careful how we spend it. And if we spend it unwisely, it will backfire. And I think that's very important. And we have to, in the long run, we have to go back to lower debt levels in order to be ready for the next crisis. And the next crisis coming, we have to be resilient again. And for this, we need new debt capacity at that point. And this means we have to, be careful how we spend it now and also come back to it.
Does Paulina have a comment on the next generation EU?
Just very briefly, I think that Markus actually set out quite well. I mean, indeed, I think both Next Generation EU, which is the EU's next multi-annual budget, and the very special resilience and recovery facility, which was put in place to now during the pandemic, I think both of them are obviously super, super important. What is also important, though, and Markus said it rightly, is to make sure that the money is spent well and spent wisely. And that's precisely why this has not been kind of free handouts in inverted commas from anyone, but accompanied by very clear programs which the member states have prepared, which the Commission has been looking at very, very carefully to see precisely that this money is spent for good investment in green technology, in digital infrastructure and other issues. So I think that surely making sure that the money is very, very well spent is certainly important. And of course, this all comes also with audit and all that ex post to make sure that the money is well spent. So I don't think I have any more comment on that. Maybe just pick up on one point Markus made on the innovation as part of the climate change debate. And I think that's absolutely crucial. It's clear that we need a lot of innovation. Where I maybe disagree a little bit is that only technological development will be enough. I don't think it will. I think we also need to look at consumer behavior as consumption behavior. But clearly innovation is an important part of it. And in that context, also the international cooperation, because clearly if what happens is that the brown assets and the stranded assets end up somewhere else, then of course we have not solved the problem in the first place. So international cooperation, I would very much agree that is crucial. Thank you.
Markus, you mentioned in your presentation that we may have debt overhang problems in the corporate sectors in years to come, and we need to find ways to make restructuring easier. Do you have any recommendations for the European rule makers or yeah?
So essentially, any economy has always Darwinian selection. So there is a lot of resources used by companies which are not so productive, and typically we have to shut down these companies and put the resources into more productive companies. And we have to put this process at the halt. No, we have not allowed this thing. And this was correct this way because there was just a huge shock. We don't want this selection when there's a huge shock. But then we have to find a way back to this. And for this, we need a very efficient, bankruptcy code. And I think I saw there an opening for Europe to harmonize the bankruptcy codes across Europe and get a more modern bankruptcy code. So it's very it's very balkanized across Europe. Every country has its own bankruptcy code. Yeah. And I think we need a more common one. And it would be a good excuse in a sense to say, let's do it together in Europe and we have a more harmonized way of doing things. And I don't know whether that's politically feasible. I haven't looked into this in the political feasibility, but I think it would be a nice opening now, and we have to go back to that.
Markus, I have a nice, maybe concluding question. We are soon running out of time. From Michel Zielinski. If we were to give countries resilience ratings, like we do credit ratings, how should we construct it? I mean, it seems to me that like North Korea is maybe not the most resilient country in the world, and other countries and systems are more resilient. Sort of how would you, comparing countries and systems, rate the degree of resilience in them? Do you have some passages in the book about that?
Yeah, so first of all, I think there's a rating between autocracies versus open democratic societies. And my claim is essentially, without proving it, that democratic societies, open societies are more resilient. They're more like a reed. There's constantly uncertainty, governments are changing and all this, but they seem more resilient, unlike the oak, which, there's a dictator, and if the dictator dies, then there's huge problems with the society. There is some resilience ratings by the OECD. So the OECD is rating countries based on resilience, but it's very much economically focused. And I think it's one important component, but we also have to incorporate the social cohesion and other elements into account. This is very, very important. So the social norms, how resilient the society is. And it would be nice to have a rating to say, okay, this societies are more resilient than the other societies. And I would argue that social norms and the willingness of people to help out each other plays a huge role in being more resilient. So we have to take a broader perspective, not only how flexible labor markets are, how flexible certain product markets are, and how competitive they are. That's one aspect to it, but also take the social aspects fully into account as well. And that, of course, is more challenging and it's more subjective. And then there will be, of course, a huge debate, if there's everybody wants to be at the top of the table.
Mm. Let me throw in a last question then from Maria Modin, who essentially asks, is there a risk of moral hazard? Like, this is more EU related question, if some countries help other countries out in dealing with a problem such as the pandemic, and sort of could that change behavior in coming crises?
Yeah, that's something Karolina was pointing out too. There could be, certain countries is more moral hazard challenges than in other countries. I would say that if you have more, well-established social norms, the moral hazard problems are less dramatic than in countries where you don't have that, and everything has to be done by government enforcement. I think that's it varies, but I wouldn't naturally say, okay, the moral hazard is bigger in this country than in that country. Would
Paulina or Karolina have a comment on that?
I have a comment very briefly. I know whether Karolina wants to go first. If not, when I have the floor, just to add a dimension, I think it's important to bear in mind that when we speak about EU countries helping each other, the EU solidarity is also helping you help yourself, right? Because the EU has an internal market where countries are exporting goods and products and services to each other. So it's in everyone's interest that the whole internal market, all EU countries are in a good place, that they are resilient, that they have well-functioning markets. So I think it's very, very simplified to kind of say that, I will sit back and wait for someone else to give me money. I think that's not the way the EU works.
Karolina, you will have the last word.
Well, I also interpreted the question as perhaps being more related to whether, if there are these transfers between countries in the EU, does that create moral hazard? I think that's a view that has some prevalence here in Sweden, because Sweden typically is a net contributor when it comes to common EU funds. I think this discussion comes up because of what happened during the Euro crisis and so forth. And at least there, I remember my Greek colleagues, they would always say that you talk about there being moral hazard because we are being given some sort of emergency loans, but this is so painful for us, so there's no way this can lead to moral hazard. So I think there's a bit of that when it comes to countries extending loans to one another for emergency reasons.
Thank you very much. Now we have run out of time. Markus, thank you so much for taking your time so early in the day. And as you hear, we all love your book truly, and we have learned a lot from reading it and from listening to you this morning. So thank you very much for that. And Paulina and Karolina, it was great having you on this seminar series again, and I hope it won't be the last time. Thank you all very much. Thank you.